For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini, Executive Director at Section27 and Executive Member of the Treatment Action Campaign. Mark Heywood joins me to discuss his book titled Get Up, Stand Up, Personal Journeys Towards Social Justice. Your book titled Get Up, Stand Up narrates your personal journeys interwoven into the broader political context you are writing about. Why did you write this book and who should be reading it?
I wrote the book because really since quite an early age, probably my late teens or early 20s, I've been involved in political struggles, liberation struggles, and in the last 20 years struggles to implement the vision of our constitution, what you might call social justice struggles. And I think after 30 years there was an opportunity to take stock and to try to make sense of those struggles, to tell the story of the struggles, because they're very different struggles. You know, the struggles of the end of the 20th century for liberation in South Africa or against Margaret Thatcher's government in Britain versus the struggles around access to HIV treatment, or more recently the struggles around access to basic education, are very different. But what are the threads that go through those struggles? And so in telling that story and trying to make sense of it, I'm also in a sense trying to help equip activists and people who are committed to transformation in 2017 and beyond, not to tell them this is the rule or this is the hard and fast learning, but really just to create a context and a space for thinking about social transformation.
Tell us about your first visit in South Africa at the age of 13. What was it that attracted you to South Africa in 1977?
Well, I had grown up in other African countries. I'd been born in Nigeria, I'd lived in Nigeria and Ghana, and moved to Botswana, to Gaborone in fact, when I was 13. And because I'd grown up in post-colonial independent African states, I'd grown up in an environment where there was not institutionalized legal racism, where it wasn't against the law for people of different races to get married, where people weren't in prison on Robben Island. And it was a shock to my system to come to a country like Botswana. And Botswana was kind of held up in some ways, perhaps naively, as a model democracy with Seretse Khama as the first president. But it was a shock to live in a country like Botswana and then know that 20 kilometers down the road across the Clockwen Gate was South Africa, and in South Africa a totally different legal and social environment operated, where there was institutionalized racism, where the ANC was banned, where there was no freedom of expression. So that drew me into South Africa and to trying to begin to be part of change in South Africa.
Your book talks about your time at Oxford. Tell us about that period of your life.
Well, I had to run away from South Africa at the beginning of 1983. And I went back to England to go to Oxford University. And when I arrived in England, England was also in the beginning period of a big political turmoil. You know, Margaret Thatcher of the Conservative Party had been elected as the Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher decided that she was going to attack all the institutions that had protected poor people, the very notion of a welfare state. To start to destroy a state-supported welfare state, she had to take on the trade unions, she had to take on various other things. So I was in one cauldron, which was South Africa. Suddenly I found myself in another cauldron, very different, which was Britain. And there was a lot of political debate. How do you deal with that? And almost by chance, I was recruited to something called the Militant Tendency, which was a Marxist wing of the British Labour Party, which stood for socialism, which was very critical of capitalism. And that was where I, if you like, started to theorize politics, theorize my experience, politically theorize my experience as a young man. And that was how I ended up in the Marxist Workers' Tendency of the ANC, which was a small group of South African exiles, largely based in London, who were also applying their minds to the question of liberation and socialism in South Africa.
You say you didn't plan to be an AIDS activist in 2008. You arrived to a decision to do a PhD in African literature, which was approved in 1994. What happened to take you on such a different track?
Well, as I've said, for about 10 years I was part of the final stages of the liberation struggle in South Africa. And for me that was a struggle about people's right to equality, people's right to dignity. We were successful in some ways in that struggle in 1994. We had our democratic election. And at that point I thought, well, maybe the struggle is over. But shortly after 1994, through meeting people like Zakir Ahmed and later Justice Edwin Cameron, I became aware of the HIV epidemic in our country. Back in the early 1990s, it was still more people projecting about the epidemic into the future and about the threat that it posed to our future. As we sit here now, we talk about it as something that we've lived through for 20 years. But I saw a connection between the liberation struggle and the struggle that would have to take place around HIV. And the connection was primarily this, and that was that HIV most affected people, women, who were unequal, who were vulnerable, who were marginalized, who were discriminated against. And HIV threatened to take away the very same dignity and equality that we had successfully fought for in overcoming apartheid. It threatened to take away dignity because people were facing discrimination, because they were getting sick without access to medicines which could help to make them well, and it threatened millions of people. So internally I thought to myself, well, you can't give up on a struggle for dignity and equality midstream, particularly when you, even if just by accident, have become aware just what a threat HIV represented to the future of South Africa.
Tell us about your role in the formation of Treatment Action Campaign, as well as your relationship with Zakir Ahmed.
Well, Zakir Ahmed I had first met in fact, 1985 in London. Zakir Ahmed was part of the same Marxist workers' tendency of the ANC. We had worked together. He would come out of South Africa to London for meetings. And when I came back to South Africa in 1989, I came back to work with Zakir in particular. He and a few others requested that I come back and do political education work with young people in Soweto and other townships out on the West Rand. So, for many, many years, starting from, nearly 30 years ago, I think, Zakir and I were collaborators, we were comrades. I think we were people who inspired each other, worked off each other's different energies and different strengths. And, I think it was because of Zakir that I was drawn in to the response to HIV, first through the working for the AIDS Law Project, and then of course at the point when Zakir instigated the formation of the Treatment Action Campaign and the many years that followed that.
In 2016, Section 27 made its efforts to prevent over 2,000 long-term psychiatric patients from being moved from Life Esidimeni, where they received appropriate care, to unregistered NGOs. Government didn't listen. As a result, more than 100 patients died horrible deaths at the unregistered NGOs they were moved to. You are a well-known social justice activist in South Africa. Do you think it is making a difference in forcing our government to better the lives of the disadvantaged people in our communities?
Well, I think it is. I think, I've been doing this work really since 1994. That's when I joined the AIDS Law Project. But I think in the last 5 or 6 years in particular, we've seen growing number of people, growing number of organizations turn to the Constitution to enforce their claims to social justice, whether it's social justice in relation to education or social justice in relation to access to healthcare services or access to proper treatment around HIV. The very notion of social justice, which has at its heart equality and equality of opportunity, has become one of the buzzwords of 21st century South Africa. And I think what's happening in this country is that people are beginning to realize their power. And they are also beginning to realize that whereas in the past they would have trusted to the ANC or they would have trusted to the government that they were going to deliver on people's dreams and aspirations and rights, people are now understanding that actually we have to organize for our own power, and they are asking, what are the instruments of our power? And what we are saying is that one of those instruments is the law, one of those instruments is the Constitution, but it's not sufficient. You have to educate yourself, you have to mobilize in your community, you have to pick your battles, you have to win your battles, and you have to have this vision, this dream, which was always the dream of the liberation struggle, of equality for everybody.
You started to write this book in 2014. However, it contains the recent midnight cabinet reshuffle where President Jacob Zuma sacked Finance Minister and his deputy. What are you saying in the book about that?
Well, as you said, I mean, I started it in 2014. That was 3 years ago. Our world in South Africa has changed very much in 3 years. The notion of state capture has come very much to the forefront. The opposition with the corruption of the Jacob Zuma government is on everybody's lips. But also we've become a country which is becoming increasingly desperate in terms of its social inequalities. And so the natural, I think, evolution of my work through the AIDS Law Project and then Section 27 and the Treatment Action Campaign has been that we have to confront these political questions. We have to confront questions of good governance, of accountability, of anti-corruption. If we can deal with these questions, if we can re-establish that those are foundational principles of democracy that must be respected, it would allow organizations like mine to retreat a little bit and concentrate on how do we ensure quality healthcare services, how do we ensure quality basic education. But if you have corruption around the resources of government, if corruption is stealing, some say hundreds of billions of rands, that's not stealing money from a vacuum, from some sort of abstract space in the air. It's stealing money out of the fiscus. It's stealing money out of pots that are meant to go precisely into quality schools for learners or into access to healthcare services. So the two are intimately connected.
You mentioned that your first realization of the depth of anger about corruption was when you attended the COSATU Section 27 and TAC conference. Tell us briefly about that conference.
Well, you know, in the 1980s and the 1990s in South Africa, you saw a rise of civic organization. If you remember back to the civics, the Alexandra civic organization, you saw a rise of trade union movements, you saw a rise of NGOs, you saw the growth of the UDF. All of that, if you like, could be called active citizenship. People were putting their hands up saying, we're prepared to take on the state, we want to overthrow apartheid, this is what we want equality, we want jobs, we want houses, we want land. But after 1994, many of those organizations collapsed. Many people who were civic leaders, civil society leaders, went into government. Some of them went into the corporate sector. So we had the weakening and almost the loss of an independent civil society to act as a watchdog on government, to act as a watchdog on the private sector. And I think the process of the last 20 years has seen the gradual regrouping of civil society organizations. And what we've been trying to do for the last 7 or 8 years is try to say, look, it's important to have organizations that work on health and on education, on access to information and housing. But it's also important that those organizations talk to each other and start to try to form a common platform of demands, that they begin to form a political front to make their demands. Let me stress, not a party political front, but a political front in the sense that all issues about human rights, equality and dignity are political issues, and they demand a political response if we are to make progress.
Do you understand why it is taking our government so long to appoint a commission of inquiry into state of capture that was released by our former public protector?
Well, I think the problem is that the power to appoint a commission of inquiry in the Constitution is given to the President. In this case, the President is deeply implicated in the corruption. So it stands to reason that the President does not want an independent commission of inquiry into state capture. So as has been the norm with President Zuma, he's seeking ways to wriggle around this. There's increasing pressure now for such a commission, including from within the ANC, including from Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa. And in the face of that increasing pressure, they're having to change tactics. And now they're saying, yes, we will have a commission, but we'll have a commission into everything. We don't want a commission into everything. We want a commission into all of the allegations about this latest phase of state capture. The role of cabinet ministers, the role of the president, the role of the Gupta family, what have been the costs, what have been the consequences. And particularly we need that commission because we have to establish the truth. We have to establish how deep do these tentacles of corruption go into our state, into our provinces, into our government departments, because we're going to have to clean it all out in order to be able to make a new beginning for South Africa based on clean and honest government.
Mark, what is your ideal South Africa and what would it take to get there?
Well, my ideal South Africa is the South Africa that we deliberately drew a picture of in the Constitution and said that by the supreme law of South Africa, we must move to put the colours into that picture. And that is a South Africa where all people have dignity, equal dignity, where all people are truly equal, where everybody has access to a certain basic quality of healthcare service that can meet their needs if they get ill, or that can prevent them from getting ill, or where every child goes to a quality school where they will get the essentials of learning that will set them up for life, for employment, for whatever they choose to do. That's the dream. Now, I will fight for that dream because I believe what is unique about South Africa is that we can realize that dream. You know, we are a country that is not a poor country. We're a country that is rich in mineral resources, agricultural resources. We're a country that is rich in its human resources. Every time I work in communities, what always strikes me is people know what to do. People know what is going on. They know how to fix the systems. We've got deep culture, we've got deep literary traditions, we've got a wonderful, fresh history, a history that comes right up to your and my noses in the form of people like Nelson Mandela, not a history that we have to go back 100 years to talk about. We have all the riches to build the South Africa that is dreamt about in the Constitution, or not dreamt about because it's not a dream. We have all the riches to build the South Africa that is prescribed by law in our Constitution. What we need, and this is what I say in the book, is for people to get up, to stand up, to look at what is their power, to realize that vision and to commence on that journey.
Finally, what are other interesting projects you are working on at the moment?
Well, you know, I am the director of Section 27. I'm also a director of the Treatment Action Campaign, and that takes about 24 hours a day. We have many interesting projects with our work around basic education, trying to empower people and organizations in provinces like Limpopo so that they can improve the schools, improve the education system. Within the health system, we're working with hospitals and clinics. We're working with the Minister of Health, with the Director General of the Health Department to try to identify and fix problems in the health system. So that is my, the mission of Section 27. But I think perhaps the most important project at the moment is what many of us, tens of thousands of us, are trying to do through organizations and campaigns like Save South Africa. South Africa is in a dangerous place. It faces a lot of risk. We have to build a movement now that can remove the cancer of corruption, but not just a movement that is against corruption. We have to build a movement that asserts rights. It has to assert what it is for, what it is that we are going to fix. And we have to build a movement that starts to galvanize hope again amongst the poorest of the poor, amongst the most marginalized people. Because I think a lot of people in our country are giving up. Their conditions are so terrible, they feel so powerless that they think that perhaps the only way forward is despair, which sounds terrible, or when they get pushed over the edge to burn and riot and destroy. That's not a way forward for our country. A way forward is through re-establishing what we stand for and embarking on a path to realize that. And that's what we're trying to persuade people, and that's what we will also be trying to persuade whoever forms the next government of South Africa, because I believe that Jacob Zuma's days are numbered, and we should be thinking about what demands do we make on whoever replaces Jacob Zuma as the president and whoever replaces the other corrupt cabinet ministers who have to go at the same time as Jacob Zuma.
That was Mark Heywood speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his book titled Get Up, Stand Up.